The intelligence folder was thin, almost dismissive in its brevity. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa opened it on his desk at the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo, scanning the contents with the practiced eye of a man who had spent decades evaluating naval aviation capabilities. What he found inside made him pause, then lean back in his chair with an expression somewhere between confusion and amusement. The Americans, it seemed, had built themselves a peculiar fighter aircraft, very peculiar indeed. "Genda," he called to his aide, Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactician who had orchestrated the Pearl Harbor attack plan with such devastating precision. "Come look at this. The Americans have created something unusual." Genda crossed the room and took the folder, his eyes moving quickly across the technical specifications and grainy reconnaissance photographs. The aircraft in question was designated the Bell P-39 Airacobra, and from the very first glance, it was clear this was no ordinary fighter. The engine, instead of being mounted in the nose like every conventional fighter Genda had ever studied, was positioned behind the pilot's cockpit. A long drive shaft ran from this mid-mounted engine forward to the propeller, an engineering solution that seemed needlessly complex and potentially fragile. "The engine is in the middle of the fuselage," Genda asked, looking up from the documents with genuine bewilderment. "Why would anyone design an aircraft this way?" Ozawa shrugged, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "American engineering philosophy, perhaps. They seem to believe that unconventional solutions are inherently superior. But look at the performance specifications. No high-altitude supercharger, poor climb rate above 4,000 meters. The aircraft performs optimally only at low and medium altitudes." Genda flipped through the pages, his tactical mind already running calculations about how such an aircraft would perform in combat against Japanese fighters. The comparison was not favorable to the Americans. "Our A6M-0 can climb to altitude quickly and maintain energy in turning fights. This Airacobra appears to be optimized for combat conditions that don't exist in modern air warfare. At low altitude, an aircraft is vulnerable to ground fire and has limited tactical options. Every principle of fighter combat emphasizes gaining and maintaining altitude advantage." "Exactly," Ozawa agreed. "The Americans have built a fighter for the wrong war. Perhaps they're planning to use it for ground attack, though even that seems questionable given its configuration." What neither man could see from those dry intelligence reports, what the photographs and specifications could not convey, was that the Bell Aircraft Corporation and the United States Army Air Forces had indeed built an unconventional fighter. But unconventional did not necessarily mean ineffective. The P-39 Airacobra was about to teach the Japanese military a lesson they would learn repeatedly throughout the Pacific War. American ingenuity, when combined with tactical adaptation, could turn apparent weaknesses into unexpected strengths. The report made its way through the Japanese command structure, accumulating annotations and assessments as it moved from desk to desk. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and whose opinion on aviation matters carried considerable weight, reviewed the intelligence summary with his characteristic thoroughness. His conclusion was unambiguous and would prove to be dramatically, almost catastrophically wrong. "The P-39 Airacobra represents a fundamental misunderstanding of air combat on the part of American designers," Fuchida wrote in his assessment. "Its poor high-altitude performance will render it ineffective against our fighters, which have been specifically optimized for combat at the altitudes where air superiority is won. The unconventional mid-engine layout adds mechanical complexity without providing compensating advantages. I assess this aircraft as a minimal threat to our air operations. Our pilots should be briefed on its weaknesses, but it does not require special tactical consideration." Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, who commanded the fighter escort for the Pearl Harbor attack and who trained fighter pilots in the aggressive turning fight tactics that had made Japanese naval aviation so formidable in China, was even more dismissive when briefing his squadrons on potential American aircraft they might encounter. He stood before a room full of young pilots, men who believed absolutely in the superiority of their training and their Zero fighters, and he used the P-39 as an example of American incompetence in fighter design. "The Americans are sending a fighter to the Pacific that cannot climb to altitude effectively," Itaya said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never lost an aerial engagement. When you encounter the P-39 Airacobra, and you will encounter it because the Americans seem determined to deploy it, despite its obvious flaws, you will use standard intercept tactics. Climb above it, which you will be able to do easily given the Zero's superior climb rate. Establish altitude advantage. Then dive on the American fighter from above, make your attack, and climb away before the Airacobra can respond. The engagement should be simple and decisive. The pilots nodded, absorbing this tactical guidance. They had no reason to doubt their commander. Japanese fighters had swept Chinese skies clean of opposition. They had destroyed American air power at Pearl Harbor and Clark Field in the Philippines. They had proven themselves superior in every engagement against Allied aircraft. Why should this strange American fighter with its backwards engine placement be any different? But there was something the intelligence reports missed, something the technical specifications could not capture, something that would only become apparent when the theories met the brutal reality of combat. The P-39 Airacobra had been designed with a specific vision of air combat in mind, and while that vision did not match what the Japanese expected or what European air warfare demanded, it aligned surprisingly well with certain types of combat that would occur in the Pacific theater. The mid-engine configuration that seemed so strange and pointless actually provided the P-39 with exceptional handling characteristics at low and medium altitudes. The heavy Allison engine, positioned near the aircraft's center of gravity, gave the Airacobra a balanced feel that translated into quick, responsive control inputs. The aircraft could roll rapidly, critical for lining up firing solutions or evading attacks. It could change direction with a crispness that belied its unconventional layout. These were not the characteristics that mattered in sustained turning dogfights at high altitude, the kind of combat Japanese doctrine emphasized and Japanese fighters excelled at. But they were exactly the characteristics that mattered in fast, slashing attacks at medium and low altitude, the kind of combat that would increasingly characterize Pacific air battles. And then there was the armament. The P-39 mounted a 37mm M4 autocannon firing through the propeller hub, supplemented by two 50-caliber machine guns in the nose and additional 30-caliber guns in the wings. That 37mm cannon was a weapon unlike anything typically mounted on single-engine fighters. It fired a shell large enough and powerful enough to destroy an aircraft with a single hit. Against the lightly constructed Japanese fighters and bombers, which sacrificed armor and structural strength for performance and range, the P-39's cannon would prove absolutely devastating. The first P-39 Airacobras arrived in the Pacific theater in early 1942, deployed to Australia and New Guinea as part of the desperate Allied effort to stem Japanese expansion. The 8th Fighter Group, equipped with Airacobras, would be among the first American units to take these unconventional fighters into combat against the Japanese. The men of the 8th had no illusions about what they were facing. Japanese fighters had proven themselves superior to everything the Allies had thrown at them. The Zero's reputation was already legendary, and now these American pilots were being asked to fly an aircraft that most experts considered inferior, an aircraft that couldn't climb, couldn't fight at high altitude, and had a weird engine configuration that made mechanics nervous. Major Boyd Buzz Wagner, one of America's early fighter aces in the Pacific and a pilot whose aggressive tactics and fearless leadership made him legendary among his peers, flew some of the first P-39 combat missions over New Guinea. Wagner understood immediately that the Airacobra could not fight the way Japanese fighters wanted to fight. Trying to engage Zeros in sustained turning battles at altitude would be suicidal. The Zero would simply outclimb and outturn the P-39, getting on its tail and staying there until the killing burst could be fired. But Wagner also recognized something that the Japanese intelligence assessments had missed. The P-39 didn't have to fight the way the Zero wanted to fight. It could fight differently, using tactics that played to its strengths rather than engaging in battles where its weaknesses would be fatal. Wagner began developing and teaching a tactical approach that would be refined and expanded by other P-39 pilots throughout the Pacific campaign. "We're not going to turn with them," Wagner told his pilots during tactical briefings at their primitive airstrip carved out of the New Guinea jungle. "The Zero wants you to turn. That's where it kills you. So we're going to deny the Zero the fight it wants. We're going to use speed, we're going to use surprise, and we're going to use that 37mm cannon to end fights before they really begin." The tactics Wagner advocated required discipline and patience that went against every instinct fighter pilots had about air combat. For generations, since the very beginning of aerial warfare in World War I, fighter combat had been about maneuvering, about getting on the enemy's tail and staying there, about the skills of turning and climbing and positioning. Wagner was asking his pilots to abandon all of that and fight in a completely different way. You see a zero. You assess the situation, Wagner continued. Do you have an altitude advantage? Do you have a speed advantage? Can you make one clean pass and then get away? If the answer to any of those questions is no, you do not engage. You break off. You reposition. You wait for a better opportunity. This isn't about being a hero. This is about killing the enemy and surviving to do it again tomorrow. The first major engagement came on April 30, 1942, when P-39s of the 8th Fighter Group intercepted a Japanese raid on Port Moresby. The Japanese formation consisted of several Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers escorted by A6M0 fighters, approaching at medium altitude around 12,000 feet. The P-39s, guided by coast watchers and radar, managed to position themselves with a slight altitude advantage before the Japanese spotted them. Lieutenant Bob McMahon was flying that day, and his account of the engagement provides crucial insight into how the P-39's unusual characteristics played out in actual combat. We dove on the formation from about 15,000 feet, McMahon later wrote in his combat report. The Zeros saw us coming and started to turn to meet us, but we weren't planning to stick around for a turning fight. I lined up on one of the bombers, got my pipper on him, and squeezed the trigger for the 37mm. What happened next shocked McMahon and would be repeated in countless engagements over the coming months. The 37mm shell struck the Betty bomber in the wing root. The thin aluminum skin of the Japanese bomber, designed for range and payload rather than survivability, offered virtually no resistance to the heavy autocannon round. The shell punched through the wing structure and detonated inside, where fuel tanks and control runs were concentrated. The entire wing structure failed catastrophically. The wing separated from the fuselage, and the bomber, transformed instantly from a functioning aircraft into tumbling debris, fell toward the jungle below, trailing fire and smoke. "One shot," McMahon said later, still somewhat stunned by what he had witnessed. "I fired one shot and the whole damn wing came off. I'd never seen anything like it." The P-39s continued their attack, making high-speed passes through the Japanese formation and then diving away before the Zeros could effectively respond. The entire engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. When it was over, 3 Betty bombers had been destroyed and 2 damaged, all for the loss of one P-39 that had been hit by return fire from a bomber's defensive guns. The Zeros, maneuverable as they were, had been unable to protect the bombers or effectively engage the P-39s because the American fighters refused to fight on Japanese terms. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, already one of Japan's most skilled and experienced fighter pilots with dozens of victories to his credit, was flying escort that day. Sakai was not a man given to exaggeration or panic. He had faced Chinese fighters, he had survived countless combats, and he approached air warfare with the cool professionalism of a master tactician. But what he witnessed during that engagement troubled him enough that he filed an unusually detailed combat report when he returned to base. "The American P-39 pilots did not engage in the manner we expected," Sakai wrote. "They did not attempt to turn with us, where our superior maneuverability would have given us decisive advantage. Instead, they made high-speed slashing attacks and broke away immediately, using their dive speed to escape before we could respond effectively. The firepower of their cannon is extraordinary and devastating to our bombers. I observed a Betty destroyed by what appeared to be a single cannon hit that caused catastrophic structural failure of the wing. We must develop new tactics for dealing with this approach." But Sakai's warning, like so many tactical insights that contradicted the prevailing wisdom, was not immediately embraced by higher command. The battle was recorded as a Japanese victory because they had succeeded in bombing Port Moresby, which was their objective. The fact that they had lost 3 bombers doing it, and that the P-39s had performed far better than intelligence assessments suggested they would, was noted but not considered strategically significant. After all, Japanese forces were winning everywhere in the Pacific. American resistance, while occasionally effective, was being overwhelmed by superior Japanese forces and tactics. The P-39 was still considered an inferior fighter that had gotten lucky in one engagement. Over the following weeks and months, however, that luck kept repeating itself. P-39 units, when properly led and when pilots adhered to the tactical discipline of refusing to fight on Japanese terms, achieved results that continued to contradict the dismissive initial assessments. They weren't winning overwhelming victories. They weren't shooting down zeros in lopsided ratios. But they were surviving, they were inflicting damage, and they were accomplishing their missions with a consistency that demanded explanation. Captain Thomas J. Lynch, who would eventually become one of America's top aces in the Pacific with 20 victories, flew P-39s early in his combat career and became one of the aircraft's most effective advocates. Lynch was a thoughtful, analytical pilot who understood that success in combat came not from having the best aircraft, but from understanding how to use the aircraft you had. He spent hours studying combat reports, debriefing pilots after missions, and refining the tactics that would allow the P-39 to compete with Japanese fighters despite its apparent disadvantages. "The Airacobra is not a bad fighter," Lynch told a group of newly arrived pilots during a tactical briefing at their New Guinea base. "It's a specialized fighter. It's a fighter that requires you to think differently about air combat. Everything you learned in flight school about getting on a guy's tail and staying there, forget it. That's not how we fight. We fight with discipline, we fight with patience, and we fight with an understanding that one good shot from that 37mm is worth more than 20 seconds of sustained fire from smaller guns." Lynch developed what he called the one-pass principle. P-39 pilots would position themselves for a single, optimal attack. They would dive on the enemy, line up the shot, fire a short, accurate burst, and immediately break away. No second chances. No trying to stay in the fight if the first pass didn't result in a kill. Disengage, climb back to altitude using speed built up in the dive, reposition, and set up another attack. It was methodical, it was disciplined, and it was completely contrary to the romantic vision of air combat as swirling dogfights and dramatic maneuvering. But it worked, it kept pilots alive, and it destroyed Japanese aircraft with increasing regularity. The Japanese response to these evolving tactics was complex and revealed important aspects of Japanese military culture during the war. On one level, Japanese tactical analysts recognized that the P-39 was being employed in ways that minimized its weaknesses and maximized its strengths. Combat reports from pilots like Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, and other experienced aviators consistently noted that American Airacobra pilots were avoiding sustained engagements and using hit-and-run tactics that were difficult to counter. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, serving as a tactical instructor for naval fighter pilots, reviewed accumulated combat reports from New Guinea and the Solomons and concluded that the standard tactical guidance for engaging P-39s needed to be revised. "The Airacobra is dangerous in specific circumstances," Nakajima wrote in a tactical directive distributed to fighter units in mid-1942. "It cannot match the zero in sustained turning combat or in climbing to altitude. However, at medium and low altitudes, in the initial moments of an engagement, the P-39 can be quite effective. Its cannon firepower is devastating to our aircraft. Pilots must avoid head-on passes where the cannon can be brought to bear most effectively, force the combat to sustained maneuvering where our advantages become decisive." This was a significant evolution from the earlier dismissive attitude. The Japanese were no longer laughing at the P-39. They were treating it as a legitimate threat that required specific tactical counters. But there was also a reluctance within Japanese command circles to admit that they had fundamentally misjudged an enemy weapon system. To acknowledge that the P-39 was more effective than initially assessed would be to acknowledge a failure of intelligence and analysis, something that was professionally and culturally difficult for senior officers to do. The ground attack role became another area where the P-39 found its niche in Pacific combat, and where Japanese forces learned to fear the Airacobra's distinctive profile and devastating firepower. That 37mm autocannon, which seemed oversized for air-to-air combat, was absolutely murderous against ground targets. Japanese supply barges, the small, lightly constructed vessels that were essential for moving troops and materials along the coasts of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, were particularly vulnerable. Major Edward "Porky" Cragg, commanding a P-39 squadron tasked with interdicting Japanese coastal supply routes, discovered just how effective the Airacobra could be in this role. "We'd patrol along the coast looking for barge traffic," Cragg recalled after the war. "When we found them, we'd come in low and fast, The 37mm would just tear those barges apart. 1 or 2 rounds would sink them or set them on fire. The Japanese started moving supplies only at night because daytime barge runs had become suicide missions. The tactical impact of these attacks went far beyond the simple material damage inflicted. Japanese forces in New Guinea and the Solomons were heavily dependent on coastal barge traffic for logistics. The roads were primitive or non-existent, the jungle was impenetrable to large-scale vehicle movement, and sea transport was the only practical way to move supplies to forward positions. When P-39s and other Allied aircraft made barge traffic impossibly dangerous during daylight, Japanese logistics ground to a halt. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, serving as an operations officer with Japanese forces in New Guinea and a man known for his aggressive, often ruthless approach to warfare, found himself unable to solve the problem of Allied air superiority and its impact on logistics. "We cannot move supplies forward during daylight without suffering catastrophic losses," Tsuji wrote in a situation report to his superiors. "American aircraft, particularly the P-39 with its heavy cannon, attack our barges with devastating effectiveness. A single aircraft can destroy multiple barges in one attack run. Our forward positions are running short of ammunition, food, and medical supplies because we cannot safely transport these materials." The psychological impact of the P-39's cannon fire was profound and often underestimated in statistical analyses. Japanese soldiers who survived attacks by Airacobras described the experience as terrifying. The sound of the 37mm firing was distinctive and unmistakable, a deep, heavy thump that was completely different from the sharper crack of machine gun fire. When soldiers heard that sound, they knew that whatever was being targeted was about to be obliterated. The shells would punch through light structures, detonate vehicles, and create casualties that were horrific even by the brutal standards of Pacific combat. This fear created a cascade of effects that reduced Japanese operational effectiveness. Troops would scatter and seek cover even when they weren't being directly targeted, disrupting operations and delaying movements. Supply personnel became increasingly reluctant to work during daylight, slowing the flow of materials to combat units. The constant threat of air attack degraded morale and increased the psychological strain on soldiers who were already fighting in some of the most miserable conditions imaginable. By mid to late 1942, the Japanese assessment of the P-39 Airacobra had undergone a quiet but significant transformation. The aircraft was no longer dismissed as a poorly designed fighter that would be easy prey for Japanese aviation. Intelligence summaries now described it as a specialized aircraft that was effective when employed in specific roles and dangerous when handled by competent pilots who understood its strengths and limitations. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding the 8th Area Army and responsible for Japanese operations in the southeast area, including Rabaul, the Solomons, and New Guinea, received regular intelligence briefings on Allied air capabilities. In one such briefing in late 1942, the intelligence officer presenting the information took care to provide a nuanced assessment of the P-39's evolving role. "The Airacobra is not the primary air superiority fighter in the American inventory," the officer explained, gesturing to a chart showing various Allied aircraft types and their capabilities. "That role is increasingly being filled by the P-38 Lightning and, in some areas, by improved models of other fighters. However, the P-39 has carved out specific niches where it remains effective: ground attack missions, low to medium altitude interception, coastal patrol, and anti-shipping strikes. In these roles, the aircraft's heavy cannon and good low-altitude handling characteristics make it a legitimate threat." Imamura, a thoughtful and capable commander who understood that underestimating the enemy was a path to defeat, nodded slowly. "So our initial assessment was incorrect." The intelligence officer chose his words carefully, aware that criticizing previous command decisions could be professionally dangerous. "Our initial assessment was based on evaluating the P-39 according to our own doctrinal priorities and our own vision of how air combat should be conducted. We assumed that because the aircraft performed poorly at high altitude, it would be ineffective overall. We failed to adequately consider that the Americans might employ the aircraft in ways that avoided its weaknesses and exploited its strengths. We also underestimated the effectiveness of the 37mm cannon against our aircraft and ground targets." This was as close to an admission of error as Japanese military culture would typically allow, and it represented an important learning moment. The Japanese had made a fundamental analytical mistake by assuming that their own priorities and doctrines were universal. that an aircraft optimized for different conditions and different tactics would necessarily be inferior. The P-39 had taught them that the Americans were capable of tactical innovation and adaptation, a lesson that would be reinforced repeatedly throughout the Pacific War. The P-39's service in the Pacific was not without significant challenges and limitations that need to be acknowledged for a complete understanding of its role. The aircraft never achieved the kind of air superiority dominance that fighters like the P-38 Lightning or the F-4U Corsair would later demonstrate. P-39 units suffered losses, particularly when pilots violated tactical discipline and allowed themselves to be drawn into sustained turning engagements where the Zero's superior maneuverability was decisive. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Westbrook, who commanded P-39 squadrons in New Guinea, was frank about the aircraft's shortcomings in his after-action reports and letters. "The Airacobra demands more from its pilots than more forgiving fighters," Westbrook wrote. "A pilot who tries to fly it like a P-40 or who engages in combat without carefully considering his tactical position will likely not survive long. The aircraft punishes mistakes, but for pilots who understand its characteristics and who maintain the discipline to fight on their own terms, the P-39 can be an effective weapon." The mechanical reliability of the P-39 was also a persistent issue, particularly in the harsh conditions of the Southwest Pacific. The complex driveshaft system connecting the mid-mounted engine to the front-mounted propeller was prone to vibration issues and required careful maintenance. The tricycle landing gear, while providing better ground handling than conventional tailwheel configurations, was vulnerable to damage on the rough, primitive airstrips carved out of jungle terrain. Engine overheating was a constant problem in the tropical climate. Maintenance crews worked under incredibly difficult conditions to keep the P-39s flying. Spare parts were often in short supply. Facilities were primitive, sometimes consisting of nothing more than canvas tents and improvised workbenches set up under trees. The humidity caused corrosion and electrical problems. Insects infested everything, and yet the mechanics persevered, cannibalizing damaged aircraft for parts, improvising solutions to problems when official repair manuals provided no guidance, and somehow keeping enough Airacobras operational to maintain the fight. By 1943, as American industrial production reached full mobilization and newer, more capable fighters became available in increasing numbers, the P-39 began to be phased out of frontline service with American units in the Pacific. The aircraft was being superseded by fighters that combined the P-39's strengths with better high-altitude performance and fewer operational limitations. But many Airacobras were transferred to Allied nations, particularly Australia, where they continued to provide valuable service in ground attack and coastal patrol roles. The Royal Australian Air Force operated P-39s with considerable success, particularly in ground attack missions supporting Australian and American ground forces in New Guinea. Australian pilots, many of whom had extensive combat experience from fighting in North Africa and the Mediterranean before returning to defend their homeland, adapted quickly to the P-39's characteristics and employed it effectively in the low-altitude combat that characterized much of the New Guinea campaign. Squadron leader Peter Turnbull, commanding an RAF P-39 squadron, appreciated the aircraft's heavy armament and ruggedness. "The 37mm is brilliant for ground attack," Turnbull told a war correspondent visiting his unit. "We can destroy Japanese positions, vehicles, and installations with just a few rounds. The aircraft takes battle damage well and generally brings our pilots home even after taking hits that would down other fighters. It's not pretty, and it's not elegant, but it does the job." The Soviet Union also received substantial numbers of P-39 Airacobras through the Lend-Lease program, and Soviet pilots achieved remarkable success with the type on the Eastern Front. This success was partly due to the fact that combat on the Eastern Front, like combat in the Pacific, often occurred at low and medium altitudes, where the P-39's performance characteristics were well suited to the mission. But that's a different story for a different documentary. For our purposes, what matters is that the P-39's success in Soviet service provided additional validation that the aircraft, when properly employed in appropriate conditions, could be highly effective despite its unconventional design. The final statistics of P-39 combat in the Pacific are difficult to assess with precision because records from the period are incomplete and often contradictory. Different sources provide different numbers for victories claimed and losses suffered. What is clear from the historical record is that P-39 units achieved respectable kill ratios when properly employed, contributed significantly to Allied air superiority in the Southwest Pacific, and played an important role in the ground attack missions that were essential to supporting Allied advances. More importantly than raw statistics, the P-39 Airacobra's service in the Pacific demonstrated crucial principles about weapon systems, tactical doctrine, and the nature of combat that remain relevant today. The aircraft proved that unconventional designs could be highly effective when matched to appropriate missions and employed with tactics that played to their strengths. It showed that initial assessments of a weapon's capabilities could be dramatically wrong if those assessments were based on assumptions about how combat would be fought rather than on how combat actually developed. And it demonstrated that adaptation and tactical innovation could transform an apparently flawed weapon into an effective tool. The Japanese learning curve regarding the P-39 also provides important insights into how military organizations process information and adapt to changing circumstances during war. The initial dismissive assessment of the Airacobra was not the result of stupidity or incompetence on the part of Japanese intelligence analysts and commanders. It was the result of evaluating an enemy weapon according to their own doctrinal framework and their own assumptions about what mattered in air combat. When the P-39 was measured against Japanese priorities like high-altitude performance and sustained turning ability, it appeared inferior. What the Japanese initially failed to recognize was that the Americans were not trying to build a fighter that matched Japanese priorities. They were building a fighter for different conditions and different tactics. The gradual Japanese recognition that the P-39 was more effective than initially believed, the evolution from dismissive laughter to wary respect, represents an organizational learning process that occurred under the pressure of combat. Pilots like Saburo Sakai reported that the Airacobra was dangerous in specific circumstances. Tactical instructors like Tadashi Nakajima revised training and combat guidance to account for the threat. Intelligence officers updated their assessments. Commanders like Hitoshi Imamura adjusted their operational planning to account for American air capabilities, including P-39 ground attack missions. This adaptation was not instantaneous, and it was not perfect. Japanese forces continued to suffer losses from P-39 attacks throughout 1942 and 1943. Japanese logistics continued to be disrupted by Airacobra interdiction missions, but the adaptation did occur, which speaks to the professionalism and tactical competence of the Japanese military, even as it was fighting a losing war against overwhelming Allied material superiority. For American pilots and commanders, the P-39 experience taught valuable lessons about making the most of available equipment rather than waiting for perfect solutions. In the desperate early months of the Pacific War, when Japanese forces seemed unstoppable and Allied resources were stretched impossibly thin, the P-39 Airacobra was available and deployable. It wasn't the fighter anyone would have chosen if unlimited options had been available, but it was the fighter they had, and pilots like Buzz Wagner, Thomas Lynch, and Edward Cragg figured out how to make it work. That pragmatic adaptability, that willingness to work with imperfect tools and develop tactics that maximized strengths while minimizing weaknesses, became a hallmark of American military operations throughout the war. The P-39 was just one example of this broader pattern. American forces would repeatedly take equipment that was less than ideal and find ways to employ it effectively through tactical innovation, aggressive leadership, and a cultural tendency toward pragmatic problem-solving rather than theoretical perfection. The legacy of the P-39 Airacobra in the Pacific extends beyond its specific combat record to influence post-war thinking about fighter design and employment. The aircraft demonstrated that multi-role capability, the ability to perform both air-to-air and ground attack missions effectively, provided strategic flexibility that was valuable even if it meant accepting some compromises in specialized performance. Modern multi-role fighters owe part of their conceptual lineage to lessons learned from aircraft like the P-39 that proved versatility could be more valuable than optimization for a single mission. The importance of matching weapon systems to the actual conditions of combat rather than to theoretical ideal scenarios was another key lesson. The P-39 was often criticized for not being an effective high-altitude interceptor, which was true but also irrelevant to most of the missions it actually flew in the Pacific. What mattered was whether it could accomplish the missions it was assigned, and in roles like ground attack, coastal patrol, and medium-altitude interception, the answer was yes. As the sun set on the P-39's combat career in the Pacific, replaced by newer and more capable fighters as American production ramped up and better aircraft became available, the strange mid-engine fighter with the heavy cannon left behind a record that was far more impressive than its initial reception would have suggested. Japanese command had laughed at the Airacobra when intelligence reports first described its unconventional configuration and limited high-altitude performance. They assumed it would be easy prey, another example of American industrial might producing quantity without quality. But combat proved otherwise. The P-39 met Japanese forces in the jungles and over the seas of the Southwest Pacific, and it fought effectively enough to earn respect from an enemy that had initially dismissed it. It destroyed Japanese aircraft and ground targets. It disrupted Japanese logistics. It supported Allied ground forces, and it brought many of its pilots home alive despite the brutal conditions and fierce opposition. The laughter stopped because reality has a way of correcting mistaken assumptions. The P-39 Airacobra, fighting in conditions where its unconventional design characteristics were assets rather than liabilities, proved that adaptation matters more than reputation, that tactical innovation can overcome apparent technological disadvantages, and that underestimating an enemy's weapons is a mistake that combat will punish severely. The strange fighter with the backwards engine taught both sides important lessons. For the Japanese, it was a lesson about the dangers of evaluating enemy capabilities through the lens of your own doctrinal assumptions. For the Americans, it was a lesson about making the most of available resources through tactical innovation and adaptation. And for students of military history, it remains a lesson about the complex relationship between technology, tactics, and combat effectiveness. The P-39 Airacobra didn't win the Pacific War. No single aircraft type did. The Allied victory in the Pacific was the result of overwhelming industrial production, effective strategy, tactical adaptation, and the courage of millions of men fighting across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle. But the Airacobra was part of that victory, a small but significant part, and its story deserves to be remembered not as a footnote about a failed design but as an example of how unconventional solutions, when properly employed, can succeed in ways that conventional wisdom says they shouldn't. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most underestimated and misunderstood aircraft, I want to hear from you. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what other Pacific War aircraft, battles, or technologies you want explored in future videos. Should we look at the development of carrier warfare, the evolution of fighter tactics, the unsung heroes of the Pacific Air War? Let me know what stories you want told. Make sure to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications because we're going to keep uncovering the real, complex stories behind the weapons and battles that shaped history. Not the simplified versions, not the clean narratives, but the messy, complicated reality where weapons that seemed like failures turned out to be effective, where initial assumptions were proven wrong by combat, and where adaptation and innovation mattered more than having the perfect tool for the job. War isn't about perfection, it's about effectiveness under pressure. It's about making what you have work against an enemy who's trying to kill you. And sometimes, it's about a strange fighter with its engine in the wrong place, proving that unconventional doesn't mean ineffective. The P-39 Airacobra taught that lesson to everyone who encountered it, friend and foe alike, and that lesson remains relevant today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next documentary where we'll continue exploring the hidden stories and forgotten lessons of World War II.